And hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Chapters here on Armstrong Television. Chapters is the show that profiles authors, editors, and publishers in West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. I'm Elliot Parker, and it's great to have you with us. One of the things that makes our region stand out is we have a number of excellent stories about people that have done extraordinary things in their life, both from a business perspective and historically speaking. And we're going to talk about one of those people today, a former resident of Ironton, Ohio. His name is Bill Lambert, and we're going to talk about the book that has just come out on him and his life. It's called Bill Lambert, World War I Flying Ace, and Sam Wilson is our guest today to talk to us about this outstanding book that he put together on the life and career of Bill Lambert. So we want to welcome him to the program. Sam is a faculty member at the School of Arts and Letters at the University of Rio Grande in Rio Grande, Ohio. He earned a bachelor's degree in history from Indiana University, a master's degree from the University of Illinois, and a PhD in history from Indiana University. He's been on the faculty at the University of Rio Grande since 1991, and we're delighted to have him here with us today to talk about his book on Bill Lambert. So Sam, welcome to the program. Good to have you here.
Thank you, Elliot. I appreciate it and happy to be here.
So tell me a little bit about when you decided to invest the time and the energy to work on Bill Lambert's life and his career. When did you make that decision, and what led up to that decision to decide to work on a book about him?
It was a call to adventure from a colleague, Ivan Tribe. He's well known around the area for his radio show on country music. He's retired now, but Ivan was putting together a local history journal and asked me to write an article. Now, I'm not from the area, so I didn't know what I could possibly write about. And ironically, it's from Huntington, West Virginia, where the call was actually given to me. Rich Brumgardner, who operates Blue Acorn Press, had a book called Fritz about a World War I soldier who actually eventually moved to Paducah, Kentucky. And he edited the book and offered it for sale, and I wanted to use it for a class. And during our conversation, he mentioned this obscure World War I pilot he knew from Ironton, Ohio. And during that conversation, it became, let's say, apparent that I could possibly write an article about Lambert. And that began the trail that took me to the Briggs Library in Ironton and the Lawrence County Historical Society to begin doing the research. Initially, it was just for the article, but during the process of being at the museum, a curator there said, "You need to speak to a man by the name of Bill Martin, who's from Ashland, Kentucky." And I contacted Bill Martin, and that began as a mentor and relationship in that he had known Lambert for the latter years of his life. Martin was, in fact, a worker at Armco at the time and knew Lambert via being introduced by a co-worker. And in the process, he had actually taken Lambert out regularly to dinner, entertained him, took him places, and actually occupied a great deal of his time and introduced him to other individuals. Even, let's say, to the point where he suggested Lambert to write his second book, Barnstorming and Girls. But more importantly, after Lambert had died, it's a curious story if you don't mind me telling it.
Sure.
Lambert left his house and legacy. First, the Air Force Museum in Dayton had first choice. They took the physical attributes of his life. The Ohio Historical Society got his furniture. It was that old. It was antique. And so 2 days after his funeral, around that time, after Lambert had died in March 1982, Martin on a whim decided to stop by Lambert's home. And while doing so, the cleaning people were actually throwing out all his papers, documents, pictures in garbage bags to throw out to the dump. And Martin saved those, and that was actually the legacy and life history of Lambert. And he still possessed those. In those were letters from World War I aviators, people, let's say, like J. Edgar Hoover, his correspondence personally with his wife and other publishers. So I had to spend time putting that together and then using that material to write the book itself. So it was a consequence of that article for a local magazine to finally realize there was potential there to write a book.
And I know that you mentioned Bill Martin and his wife Phyllis in your acknowledgement section. That's one of the first two people that you mentioned. And it sounds like without that relationship and without him being able to save some of Bill Lambert's artifacts, it would have made doing this book a whole lot more difficult.
It would have been practically impossible. It would have been what you do see now sometimes, a hero worshiping, let's say, rather flawed approach to Lambert, because the essential documentation would be missing. The Air Force Museum, of course, and we're in a bookstore now, but usually what happens here is we hire archivists to work in museums and then, of course, archives. And the Air Force Museum had Royal Fry, for whom the Air Force Research Center is now named after. And he was the youngest P-38 pilot in World War II. He spent 15 months in a prisoner of war camp. And it was so friendly, he actually became best friends with his jailer. They visited each other after the war. But he knew all these pilots. He had a love of swing music. He's responsible for the concert every year at the Air Force Museum on swing music. He also had a love of World War I aviation, and as a consequence of that, he would entertain people like Eddie Rickenbacker at his home, Reed Chambers, people like that were regular visitors to his home. And he really discovered Lambert, but also not being an archivist. He had a graduate degree in education and history at Ohio State University. They took the physical regalia of Lambert, his uniform, Lambert, during the war, his good friend Daly had to go to apologize to an Australian commander's camp on the 21st of April 1918. Now, to most people, this date doesn't mean anything, but that was the same camp where the Australian commander's machine gunners actually shot down Richthofen, the Red Baron. So when the plane went down, Daly was there when they cannibalized the plane, so he brought back souvenirs. And then Lambert's home was a fabric of Richthofen's plane and a timing chain. Well, the Air Force Museum wanted those things. They didn't realize the significance of the written documentation. Now they do want, and I promised them copies along with, let's say, the Wright State Museum, where I've already given some documentation, and the Lawrence County Library, Briggs Library, will also get copies of Lambert's papers. So they can actually now make them available to other people. But these things would have been destroyed. They should have been initially sent to the Air Force Museum, but weren't. And you can go there today and you can find a glass case in the World War I exhibit which actually has Lambert's stuff in there. His boots, his uniform, his Distinguished Flying Cross, other things that he invented. He was quite a magnificent pilot, as well as, let's say, mechanically inclined. He patented a few items in his life, but also was very much involved in making his airplane better. And as a matter of fact, some of the inventions he made on his SE-5 were later adopted by the entire RAF. So he's a remarkable figure in that regard. But we're lucky that his legacy was preserved, so we could actually know him now, years later, actually 30 years after he's passed away.
Yeah, it's fantastic, and all of that works its way into the book so well, and you do it so well. We learn a few things about Lambert. We learn that he's a native of Ironton. As you talked about, he flew for the British Royal Air Force in 1918. He was the second highest scoring ace in World War I with 22 victories. And this was most achieved at that time by an American pilot. At that time, no one had achieved more than that. I think when we think about flying and military aircraft today, we see the F-16 and the B stealth bomber, but we learn a lot about just how intricate and how, in some ways, dangerous flying was during World War I, and we see a little bit of that through what Bill's experiences are. Can you tell us a little bit about what he had to undertake every time he got into the plane, and what that was like, with the kind of risks and challenges he had to face every time he was in the plane?
Well, we have to understand that when you're going up in the plane, it's like going deep sea diving. You have to dress up with all these layers of clothing, because when you're going from, let's say, ground level or sea level up to as high as one time 22,000 feet, the oxygen is so light, the pressures on the individual. You're in a machine that basically is canvas and wood with a very viable engine with, as a matter of fact, machine guns on it. So it's not like you see today, when you see a F-16 taking a quarter mile to make a turn. That's not possible in an SE-5 or a Fokker D-7. And so they were inventing the tactics as they were flying themselves. The machines kept, and the technology becoming more and more innovative as the war went on. So the war that Lambert finds in 1918 is quite different from 1915, when the Fokker scourge is taking place. So whenever a new innovative process takes place, the other side gets the advantage. Briefly, if it's the Germans with the Fokker, the British have to catch up, and thereby you see this machination going back and forth by both sides. But when he goes up there, by that point in time, we developed the idea of no longer the lone hunter, let's say like Immelman as the case may be, or Bolke. Now you're having squadrons taking place. And so they're operating as squadrons. The tactics have evolved to where they're supporting the ground troops, ground strafing, something Lambert really did not like to do, as you saw in the book. The fact is it becomes an important wing because of the stalemate that takes place on the Western Front. And so the war goes to another front, which is the air, and the air becomes viably a part for reconnaissance and then for an offensive operation in the war. And later on, as we well know, becomes a huge significant factor in combat in the 20th century. So it goes from, let's say, it's very, very, soon after the use of the airplane by the Wright brothers to where it becomes a major force in war. Of course, the war will be won on the ground, but the air war's, accompaniment to the victories of the Allies cannot be underestimated. And one of the factors we have to understand, let's say, is that because of the initial factor of the air war, the pilots themselves are very much treated as celebrities. If I would ask who was the greatest American pilot of World War II, most people would not know. But it's Eddie Rickenbacker in World War I. Rickenbacker is able to parlay his success as a pilot into substantial financial gain to the point, let's say, he will eventually buy Eastern Airlines. And when his car company folds, let's say, a bank will give him a check based on his reputation for $25,000, probably $250,000 in the 1920s. That's not, that's an awful lot of money at that point in time. So he and someone like Lindbergh are able to use their experiences and make great success in their lives. And a lot of pilots don't do that. In the British sense, they extol the virtue of the squadron, not the individual. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons Lambert's not known. Even when he's writing his book, Combat Report, the Raymond Collisall, the great World War I ace who becomes the Royal Canadian Air Force, Marshal, who communicates with Lambert. Collisall, as a matter of fact, is extolling Lambert. You should write about the squadron. And even the squadron history of number Squadron 24 does have the same basic approach, where no names are mentioned except in the back they're listing all the names of all the pilots and all the sergeants, the crew. But during the story, the reporting of the squadron in the war, there are absolutely no names reflected, let's say, of pilots and what they accomplished. I can read what Lambert's doing. They're talking about Lambert because I know Lambert's story. Mm-hmm. But the purpose is to extol the squadron. And so when Lambert sees someone like Rickenbacker taking advantage of his war effort, he finds it quite distasteful. And in fact, he hated Rickenbacker his whole life. For a lot of it, probably being successful is one of them, but also because of the way he parlayed that into a successful enterprise and basically bragged about himself. You were not supposed to do that. Lambert follows the British tradition, and he doesn't think what he's done is that spectacular, because there are pilots in the British Air Force like McCudden, Manick, Bishop, who have significantly more victories than he does, probably at least 56 people. And he's not really aware of how many victories he has. It's later on it becomes apparent. And later on in life when he tries to, and he does receive the acknowledgement for what he did during the war. And one of the benefits is that he does survive the war, where a lot of the great pilots do not, as a matter of fact. But he becomes a non-entity trying to preserve his anonymity in Ironton, Ohio, where Rickenbacker is out there, making headway of himself. That he found distasteful.
Interesting. That's very interesting. And, one of the things that's so great about your book is we see pictures of Bill Lambert at various points in his life and his career. But I wanted to ask you about the picture that's on the front cover. And we'll put this up on the screen so our audience can see it. But we have a picture of Lambert with his pilot's goggles on, and he's kind of got his arm draped over a plane. Can you tell us a little bit about where that picture was taken and what's he doing there, what's going on in that photo?
It's one of the things Lambert did. He was an artist. He was took a great many pictures. His whole, what Bill Martin found were a huge amount of pictures, okay? And even took copies of those pictures. As well as, let's say, he was, like say, he had patents he had come up with during his lifetime. He saved everything. That's a picture of Lambert, let's say, when he's already, let's say, in the RAF. It's not the RAF yet, it's the Royal Flying Corps. The Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service will join together on the 1st of April 1918, become the Royal Air Force. So Britain has its Air Force, an independent arm of the military on that date. We don't have ours in the United States till 1947. So that's a picture of Lambert during the war, getting in to fly. I believe that picture's in Canada, if I'm not mistaken, where it's taken. He got to the point he was so proficient as a pilot that after going through training in Canada, he will actually become a trainer for pilots. So he's really quite astute as a pilot, and he's done something quite different. He was raised, as he said, with guns and machines. He's continually working with his machine. When he brings his plane in, he'll go with his mechanics, the air mechanics. He'll work on the plane, making it better, getting an advantage. He'll make adjustments like with the dihedral, which will give him greater speed and greater climbing ability over other planes. Like I say, that's later adapted by the RAF to other fighter squadrons. By the time Lambert's getting into the war, they are developing fighter squadrons, each flying the same plane. So that's how much the air war has evolved. You have now bomber squadrons. He's asked in an interview, well, how did you become a fighter pilot? Just lucky, just chance. But it's also because he's a great pilot. When he goes to Britain, they have him showing planes to visiting generals. Take that one up for the general, would you please? He's that good. When they go on a flight, let's say, they send them out on a flight and they're training, he's the only one that actually makes it back in the plane, where everybody else has to be brought back, let's say, with trucks. So Lambert is incredibly skilled as a pilot and as a mechanic. So he'll go through and he'll find things, he'll make adjustments, give himself, let's say, an advantage, and it pays off in the air. It's one of the reasons he's able to survive. He's a modern technocratic individual, much like Rickenbacker. Rickenbacker himself raced cars. He owns the Indianapolis 500 Motor Speedway. They're basically enamored with speed. They're enamored with modern machinery. Someone like Richthofen, he's a 19th century aristocrat. He's a hunter. Even the word Staffel means hunting squadron in German. He collects victories for his victories, whatever look like souvenirs. He'll land his plane and cut out, let's say, the number from a plane and put it in his den.
Wow.
Much like he would, let's say, a boar's head when he was hunting. So
Sure.
One of his subordinates would sit there and say, years later, I don't think he ever did a loop out of the sheer joy of just flying. It was all to him, let's say, hunting. Well, Lambert was enamored with machine. Lambert's the 20th century here, where Richthofen is the 19th century. And you see that transition taking place. And one of the reasons Lambert survives the war is his understanding of his machine, his ability to understand modern technology.
Very interesting. That's very interesting, and we see him being skilled in so many ways with the planes and knowing how they work throughout the book. I wanted to ask you about Chapter 10, which I found to be all the chapters in the book were outstanding, but this one really caught my attention because you talked to us a little bit about when Lambert comes back from the war. And you talk a little bit in Chapter 10 at the beginning about how he had what we would commonly refer to nowadays as PTSD. And you write that one of the things that happened was that Lambert had a complete personality change. He went from a social, confident man, anxious to try new experiences, able to get along with almost anyone, to in his old age, sort of antisocial, fearful of anything new, and increasingly isolated. Was that something that happened as he got older? It got worse, or what was that like when he came back, or was it just a sudden change trying to get back into sort of normalized civilian life that led to that?
I don't think it was a sudden change, but he had to always be in control. Control is what gave him the ability to survive. And as he got older, that control factor began to take over. The disappointing thing is we don't have letters from him before the war. All of them are after the war. So we really don't know what his personality was like, but through his correspondence with other pilots, you see a different Lambert than you see in his social life in Ironton as he's getting older. And to give you an example, here's someone who used a roller from a shade. If you were in the plane, you had to look at your map. You have to unfold this thing in the air, the wind coming at you, right? How could you follow that map? You'd find, certain, let's say, items on the ground, let's say a barn or something, or a river you'd follow, whatever the case may be. But he was able, let's say, to create a rolling map that was the envy. It's in the Air Force Museum now. You'd pull it down, you'd put the map there, you could see where you were at. So he was able to invent things like that. So here is someone who did that. But when he got older, for example, an individual who was his friend, Klaus Starker, who now lives in, I think, Chesapeake or Proctorville area, he was introduced to Lambert through Bill Martin. He would take Lambert out to dinner. He would take him to the Air Force Museum for meetings. And Starker, when he took him to a meeting, would have to drive the same route, stop at the same gas station in Fairborn on the way back to fill up. Now Lambert would thereby put his finger inside the gas tank to make sure it was full.
Wow.
He was worried about, let's say, making sure he'd make it home.
Yeah.
And then when if Starker decided to take a second route for scenic purposes, Lambert became aware, what are we going? What are we doing? Will this road get us back to Ironton? It became this sense of fear. Here was someone who was maneuvering a plane in a foreign country, fighting other planes, ground support, not knowing where he was at, and flying back and forth to his base, who could find his way around with no difficulty at all, worried about getting home from Dayton, where he went many times, to Ironton on our, international highway system, or interstate highway system, excuse me. So he became, let's say, more and more, let's say, in many cases, trapped in his own past. He lived in the past. And it got to the point, let's say, that his house became a museum to the past. His 4 years of, or rather 4 months on the Western Front influenced who he was the rest of his life. And that determined his personality. And you could see that, let's say, with his dealings with women, with people in general, and with his own ability to handle social situations. So it did determine, in many respects, someone who was brave enough. We understand that lifespan of a pilot, like you're talking 3 to 6 weeks on the Western Front. Yeah. He lasts a 4 months of horrendous conflict, which is the great German offensive of 1918, Operation Michael. And he survives that, comes back, and later on you see this sense of fear with him having to be in control. And that forces him not to take other chances in life. He has offers when he designs and even patents a wing for an airplane. Even when he does that, it's already obsolete because he's looking at straight wings when he was flying. By the 1920s, they're already tapered wings. And even though he gets a patent, he gets a letter from a man from Olympia, Washington, who wants him to work. They should work together to build these planes for the Chinese, which is experiencing the Japanese invasion. He goes, there are rich Chinese in America, businessmen who want to buy these things. You want to work with me. He would not leave Ironton. It would mean giving up his life, giving up control, going somewhere else. He'd have to rely on another individual. So he was hesitant because of his own ability to survive the war, being an individual. As he got older, it became more and more difficult, in that case, to deal with situations he was no longer able to control. What gave him the success in the air hindered him later on in his private life. And you could see him having problems, how the war, and again, what we call shell shock at that period in time, or combat fatigue, really affected him. Yeah. It did determine his personality afterwards. He became far more cautious, where he might have been rather insouciant, let's say, early on, not carefree as the case may be. He became more controlling and more, let's say, unwilling to make such a decision as he would have, let's say, in the air in 1918.
Now, when you do a book on someone like him, who's had such a rich life and has done so much and lived quite a long time, he died, I believe, in 1982. Yes. So lived a long time, well long after the war was over. How do you determine, Sam, what to emphasize or how to structure the book? And I know you mentioned a moment ago that we lost a lot of his early correspondence, but thanks to the records and the relationships that you developed and helping collect some information about him. How do you determine when you're looking at all this, this is something I want to write about, this is something that I want to put into a chapter, and this maybe is not as important? How do you go through making what ultimately the determinations on what you're going to use and what you're going to maybe set aside?
Well, there's the rough draft copy of this, which is probably 3 times the size.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And that's what happened. When I wrote his life story. And oftentimes you go into tangents. And afterwards it was, now we have to edit it so it's readable. And the goal was, as we were talking before, to write a scholarly book that was readable. That was the objective. And I think we achieved that. So eventually I worked with my editor and we go, okay, let's get rid of this, let's get rid of that, let's rewrite this. So there's a whole other section. In fact, ironically, I had done a book signing at Joe Unger's shoe store in Ironton. And there's a section there where I had interviewed Joe, and it's eliminated. I sent it to him. He was really pleased to read it, talking about the beginning of Joe Unger's shoes, this sort of thing. he and his father looking at Lambert when Lambert was the center of the annual Memorial Day parade in Ironton. Well, those sorts of things, let's say, when I was researching, I included in the book, but they were left out because it had to be concise about Lambert. So it was the editing that determined the focus that we were going on. So I'd write, let's say, about different aspects of his life as an artist, his life. So you went from a chronological approach during the war to where you're talking somewhat topically later on. Okay, I'm talking about the 1920s, we're talking about the interwar period, then we're talking about the Lambert they knew. All the interviews about different people, those who thought like Kay Welsh, let's say, who lived, she's still alive in Kentucky, who was a neighbor who just loved Lambert, didn't know he was a pilot till his funeral. He was just a grandfather figure to her. To other people like an Elizabeth Wilson, who when I was interviewing her, rushed out the room because she didn't want to give me an interview. She just hated the man. And so you had this disparity of people, let's say, coming in, giving different stories. So I put that in the book, showing this is the Lambert they knew, where they could actually see what we talked about earlier, the personality change. Those people who knew Lambert later on in life through correspondence found a wonderful person who answered all their requests, sending autographed pictures, carried on correspondence, all sorts of questions as the case may be. And they found a wonderful human being who became somewhat of, let's say, a model who they were admiring. They were, of course, hero worshiping this individual. It's 50, 60 years after the war, and they have this romantic vision of what Lambert did. It wasn't romantic, as a matter of fact, fighting in the war, but it's become that way afterwards to these individuals. They got a different Lambert than the people who were dealing with him on a daily basis in Ironton. I remember Doris Robinson. Her and her husband owned a small convenience store, and her husband would get upset at Lambert when he'd come in to buy tobacco, and she'd have to say, well, just let him go. Who knows what the war did to him? So you had those dichotomies where people, let's say, would go across the street to get away from him, and all of a sudden children would go with him to walk his dog, for example. So when you begin to structure a book like this, you're structuring it, let's say, based on the information you have. So what became topically based on his own story, or pardon me, chronologically based on his own story, becomes topically based on what he's doing. Okay, well, he's writing the book. Lambert is an artist. He becomes somewhat of a, I've taken his artwork to people who were like Jim Allen, who I was at the University of Rio Grande, and Jim basically, analyzed his painting, saying, and it was similar to what other people had said in his writings. You're very good in the details of the plane. It's like the controlling factor. Everything had to be perfect. He's writing Frank Cheeseman in London to get specific coloring, specific diagrams to make it as historically accurate. But as Bill Martin points out, all the scenery is the same in all your pictures. So he was self-taught. Yeah. And he was still quite talented. He writes 2 books, and one hurts his reputation afterwards. The other one is edited quite nicely on his, but it's one of the major sources written by a pilot about action in the First World War, because the British didn't do that, didn't extol that. But he writes this, and thank God he does, because otherwise we wouldn't have that view, not just of him, but of what it was like to be in the war in general, because the British soldiers didn't write such things. So it was really a valuable piece. But as writing the book, the story took a life of its own after a while. Each section demanded a great deal of attention, so I spent a great deal of time, on the interwar period. And that chapter itself could be a book, what I wrote.
Sure.
And so editing it down, that's nice, but we need to keep this out.
Yeah.
And to the point, let's say, where Starker took him to Bob Evans and Rio Grande for dinner. He went through 141, that back route, and he ended up stopping, I think, at Waterloo. And Lambert goes, I barnstormed in that field there. Well, when I investigated, you find out about the Waterloo Wonder. So should I describe something about, Waterloo when I'm describing the scene? And that's where you get the 3 times the size, and that's what has to be eliminated afterwards to make it readable.
Understand.
But yeah, it has to become, let's say, a difference between a job or hobby and a passion. It became a passion to tell a story, and that's why you're involved in it, and I hope that comes through.
Oh, it does. It absolutely does. So I have to ask you, are you working on another book, or you have an idea for another book, and if so, what's it going to be?
Okay, I started working on something that dealt with, let's say, a volunteers in the American Revolution from Virginia who fought at Guilford Courthouse against the 23rd Welsh Fusiliers. and you have a family fighting in there, and one brother is killed, the other one goes on, of course, to survive, and to tell their story, let's say, as they're involved in this battle. In the process of writing this, however, it's that tangent I'm talking about. You have to learn all about how did the war take place, how did the battle take place, who was in charge. So now I'm involved in the conflict between Clinton and, of course, Cornwallis, and their lack of cooperation, as the case may be, which facilitates, let's say, a little bit of incompetence on top of the British hierarchy. What you have here is a situation where unfairly the American cinema has portrayed the British soldier in movies like The Patriot, as well as, let's say, Last of the Mohicans, as being rather incompetent. The British soldiers conquered the greatest empire in the world, and so they're treated somewhat unfairly in those by American cinema. But the fact is, it might be better to lay the blame on those in charge than it would be, let's say, those in the trenches. So pursuing that is now the project I've begun, but of course I'm getting a lot of calls for World War I as well. And I will be putting Lambert on display along with other people at the Bob Evans Farm Museum beginning in April next year. It will run for about 9 months till December, where they'll be able to see pictures of Lambert, some of his physical attributes, as well as pictures and photographs from all over the world of World War I soldiers. So it's also free to the public. So if you're at the Bob Evans Farm restaurant, you can check it out, as a matter of fact.
Excellent. Very good.
So
Very good.
We're keeping busy.
That sounds good. Sounds good. And that next book sounds fantastic as well. So we wish you good luck on that.
Thank you.
So in our final moment, Sam, if any of our audience wants to get in contact with you to talk to you about your writing or this book on Bill Lambert, or they want to get copies of the Bill Lambert book, how can they get in contact with you, and where can they get copies of your book?
Well, the book, I believe, is being sold by the Jesse Stewart Foundation. And of course, it's online at Amazon and the McFarland webpage. I've got copies to sell. They can contact me at the University of Rio Grande go to the webpage and get my email address and phone number, and I answer everyone, as a matter of fact. And in fact, I had someone contacting me last week about an antique book on the war. They wanted to know how they could sell it, how much it was worth, and I had to steer them in the right direction.
Sure.
So I become all of a sudden, let's say, a middle person for book buyers, apparently, which is you don't mind doing. But I'm happy to talk to anyone about the war, and communication is continuing, and for any question in general. But thank you very much, Elliot, for having me. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. And our guest today has been Dr. Sam Wilson, professor of history at the University of Rio Grande in Rio Grande, Ohio. His latest book, Bill Lambert, World War I Flying Ace, a resident of Ironton, Ohio. It is a fantastic story about a hero from our region that many people don't know a whole lot about. So if you like World War I, you like piloting, you like anything with regards to aviation, we encourage you to check out Bill's book. So Bill, thanks again for coming. And when you get that second book finished, we'll have you back on to talk about it.
I appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
You're very welcome.
My pleasure.
Good to be with you. And we also want to take a moment to say thanks to Natalie Sheets and the staff of Empire Books and News for providing our on-site support and assistance today. We encourage you to come down to Empire Books and News and check out their wide array of authors, books, magazines, and periodicals right here at the store. Many of the authors and publishers and editors that you've seen featured here on Chapters have their works for sale right here at Empire Books and News, so we encourage you to stop by, talk to Natalie and her staff, and they can get you taken care of with any reading need that you're looking for right here at Empire Books and News at Pullman Square. We appreciate them sponsoring us each and every program here on Chapters. And if you're a user or a fan of social media, we've made it possible for you to reach out and stay in contact with what's going on here on the program via social media. If you like us to use email, you can send us an email address to the address that's right here at the bottom of the screen, lp4@zoominternet.net. We do ask that you provide your name and where you're writing from when you do email us so that we can keep track of that information. If you want to go back and check out our YouTube postings of previous Chapters programs, we've made that possible for you as well through the Armstrong One Wire page on YouTube, and that address is here at the bottom of the screen. Once you type that into your computer, just click on the Chapters tab, and we have over 3 years worth of episodes of author, editor, and publisher publisher interviews archived there for you as well. And if you're a Facebook user, we have a Chapters page on Facebook, and that address is facebook.com/chapters, or you can go to facebook.com in the search bar, just type in Chapters, and our more recent programs have been archived there as well, and you can interact and converse with viewers who are watching the program on a regular basis. So if you like email, you like YouTube, you like Facebook, we've got you covered here on Chapters and ways for you to reach out to the program. And we know many of you have done that, many of you have watched those episodes and commented on that, and we appreciate that so very much. So please keep those comments coming and that feedback coming as well. And that's going to do it for us this time on Chapters, but please come again next time. And in the meantime, stay tuned to this station for news and views that impact you and your community.